A single sword stood fixed in stone, a test of destiny for a future king. This image is legendary, but did the man behind the myth ever truly draw breath? We are embarking on a quest to peel back the glittering layers of fantasy and search for the historical King Arthur. By the end of this journey, you will possess a clear understanding of the real evidence and theories separating the man from the legend. We will examine ancient battle records, scrutinize crumbling ruins, and confront a mystery over 1,000 years old. Was Arthur a forgotten war leader, a Roman officer, or a fiction woven from desperate hope? What you believe about this iconic king is about to be challenged. What does the name King Arthur truly mean to you? Our search begins not in a grand castle, but on a single, fragile line of poetry. In a Welsh poem known as Decoded, composed around the year 600, a bard mourns the fallen warriors of a northern kingdom. Among the elegies, he praises one hero, saying, "He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur." That is it, a fleeting comparison to a figure already so renowned by that time that his name was a benchmark for valor. This is the earliest whisper of Arthur in all surviving literature. He is not a king here, not a ruler of Camelot, but a paragon of military might, a legend already in circulation among the Britons. This tiny, tantalizing reference tells us one crucial thing. Within a century or two of the period he supposedly lived, the name Arthur carried immense weight, but it offers no history, no biography, only the echo of a reputation. The first real attempt to give this legend a skeleton comes from a shadowy and deeply problematic source. Around the year 830, a manuscript appears, the Historia Brittonum, often attributed to a monk named Nennius. Here, Arthur steps forward from poetic allusion into a list of military campaigns. Nennius presents him not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, a leader of battles who fought alongside the kings of the Britons. He then catalogues 12 great victories against the invading Saxons, culminating in the famous triumph at Mount Badon. This feels like history. It provides names, places, a narrative of resistance. But we must pause and ask a critical question. Nennius was writing nearly 300 years after these battles were said to have occurred. That is a gap longer than the entire history of the United States. His sources were a mixture of oral tradition, fragmented chronicles, and outright legend. His purpose was not dispassionate history, but to craft a glorious past for the struggling Britons, a national hero when they desperately needed one. This is the foundational challenge that haunts every step of our quest. These early sources are not windows into the 5th or 6th century. They are portraits painted centuries later, their colors mixed from both memory and desire. Arthur, from his very first appearance in the written record, is already a fusion of history and folklore. The man, if he existed, is obscured by the very process meant to remember him. Each scribe, each bard added a layer, transforming a possible war leader into an impossible symbol. So we are left with a dilemma. We have a powerful legend attested to early and a detailed military biography written very late. Between them lies a chasm of silence, filled only by the echoes of stories passed down by generations. To find the man, we must look not just at these words, but beneath them, to the landscape of a Britain crumbling in the wake of Rome's fall. That single line of poetry and Nennius's battle list were mere whispers compared to the thunderous voice that spoke next. In the year 1136, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth published a work that would change everything, the history of the kings of Britain. This book was not a dry chronicle. It was a sweeping, sensational epic, and it gave Arthur a throne, a court, and an empire. Geoffrey's Arthur was no longer just a dux bellorum, a leader of battles in the muddy fields of post-Roman Britain. He was a majestic, crown-wearing monarch who defeated the Saxons, conquered Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and even Gaul, creating a vast Atlantic empire that rivaled Rome itself. This was the birth of King Arthur as we fundamentally imagine him, a sovereign of unparalleled power and prestige. But Geoffrey did not stop with political conquest. He populated this new world with characters who would become immortal. He introduced the wizard Merlin, weaving ancient Welsh prophetic tradition into a powerful advisor who orchestrates Arthur's very conception through magic. He gave Arthur a queen, Guinevere, of noble Roman descent and a court of loyal knights. And while he did not name the castle Camelot, he described its most famous seat, the City of the Legions, often identified as Caerleon in Wales, laying the foundation for that iconic, glittering stronghold. The impact of this book cannot be overstated. It was a medieval bestseller copied and read across Europe. It provided a glorious, unified past for a fractured Britain, a story of native British triumph that resonated deeply. Yet for our historical search, it was a catastrophe of creativity. Geoffrey claimed his work was based on a very ancient book in the British tongue, a source no one else ever saw. Modern scholarship views it as a brilliant, inventive synthesis of earlier fragments, classical literature, and outright fabrication. He took the tiny, fragile seed of a possible historical figure and grew it into a magnificent, wholly fictional tree. Every knightly adventure, every magical encounter, every detail of chivalric pageantry that would blossom in the later French romances finds its root here. Geoffrey of Monmouth gave us the Arthur of legend, and in doing so, he buried any trace of the Arthur of history under a mountain of captivating fiction. The template was set, and the waters of truth became impossibly muddied. From this point forward, anyone searching for the man would first have to dismantle the magnificent myth. Geoffrey's epic invention left us with a glorious but utterly fictional king. To find the man behind the myth, we must therefore look away from the shining castles and back into the shadowy, violent century that followed Rome's collapse. This was a time so poorly recorded that historians call it the Dark Ages, a period where history itself seems to fade into obscurity. It is within this fog that scholars search for a figure who could have inspired the legend, and they have proposed several compelling, yet entirely unproven, candidates. The first is a man who predates the traditional Arthurian timeline by centuries, yet bears a strikingly similar name. Lucius Artorius Castus was a Roman military officer stationed in Britain in the late 2nd century. His tombstone, found in modern-day Croatia, records that he led a force of British legionaries on a campaign in Armorica, or Brittany. Could the memory of a successful Roman commander named Artorius have lingered in British folklore for generations, his name eventually attaching itself to new stories of a native hero fighting invaders? It is a tantalizing linguistic clue, but a fragile thread stretched across 300 years of silence. More chronologically plausible are figures from the 5th and 6th centuries. One is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British war leader praised by the contemporary monk Gildas as the last of the Romans. He is credited with organizing the British resistance and achieving a major, but unnamed, victory against the Saxons. Some theories suggest Arthur was not a separate person, but a later legendary alias for Ambrosius, or perhaps his brilliant subordinate. Then there is Riothamus, a British king who crossed the English Channel in the year 470 to aid the Roman Empire against the Goths in Gaul. His story contains eerie echoes of legend, a British king leading his men across the sea on a noble campaign, only to be betrayed and to disappear after his final battle. Could this historical tragedy have merged with tales of a British war leader at home, forming the core of Arthur's continental campaigns and his mysterious final departure? Finally, there is the simplest and perhaps most likely explanation. The name Arthur might not belong to any of these recorded figures at all. He could have been a phenomenal but locally famous battle leader who won a decisive victory at the legendary Battle of Badon Hill, a triumph so significant it halted the Saxon advance for a generation. In the desperate oral tradition of a people clinging to survival, This one brilliant commander's name and his great victory could have been the seed. Over centuries, that seed absorbed every other story of resistance, every memory of Roman order, and every hope for a returning golden age. The lack of consensus is not a failure of scholarship, but a testament to the nature of the evidence. We are trying to identify a single face in a shattered mosaic where most of the pieces are lost forever. Each candidate offers a plausible fragment of the puzzle, a piece of the legend's DNA, but none can claim to be the definitive historical Arthur. The search, therefore, becomes less about naming one man and more about understanding the turbulent world that needed such a hero to be born. The name itself provides the first compelling clue. Lucius Artorius Castus was a real historical figure, a senior Roman officer whose career is etched in stone, quite literally on a surviving tombstone. In the late 2nd century, he served as the prefect of the 6th Legion Victrix, stationed at the fortress of Eboracum, modern-day York in northern Britain. His inscription records a fascinating detail that he later led a force of British legionaries on a military expedition across the sea to Armorica, which is Brittany in Gaul. Here we have a documented commander bearing the resonant name Artorius, leading British troops on a campaign from the island. The echoes are immediate. Could this not be a kernel of truth, a memory of a great leader that survived in oral tradition? Proponents of this theory push the parallels further. The legion Castus commanded was reinforced by Sarmatian cavalry, fierce horsemen from the steppes of what is now southern Russia. These Sarmatians had a rich warrior culture, centered around a sword-worshipping ritual where a blade was thrust into the ground as an object of veneration. Does that sound familiar? The image of a sword fixed in the earth, whether in stone or ground, is central to Arthurian lore. Furthermore, these Sarmatian troops served in Britain for generations, and their legends included a heroic leader and a brotherhood of elite warriors. Could the folklore of these stationed cavalrymen have slowly blended with British tales, transferring the name of their Roman commander, Artorius, onto a new mythic hero of the land? It paints a vivid picture, a fusion of Roman authority, exotic steppe culture, and native British storytelling simmering together for centuries. But the theory faces one enormous chronological obstacle. Lucius Artorius Castus lived and served around the year 180. The traditional time frame for a historical Arthur, based on the Battle of Badon, is the late 5th or early 6th century. That is a gap of 300 years. Could a man from the time of the Roman Empire's height truly be remembered as a hero of the Dark Ages? Legends are not history books. They are living stories that bend time, compress events, and attach powerful names to new contexts. The name Artorius, rare and distinguished, could have become a title of honor, a legendary brand applied to later champions. Perhaps a later war leader achieving great deeds was compared to the legendary Artorius of old, and over generations, the two figures merged into one. The theory of Lucius Artorius Castus is not a claim of identity, but one of origin. It suggests how a name and a set of martial motifs, a sword in the ground and a band of elite horsemen, could have entered the bloodstream of British myth, lying dormant for centuries before crystallizing around a figure from a much later, darker age. It is a story about how legends are built, layer by layer, from fragments of real but distant history. This connection to the Sarmatian cavalry opens a door to one of the most fascinating and eerie parallels in the entire Arthurian mystery. The Sarmatians were not just foreign soldiers, they were a nomadic people from the Pontic Caspian steppe with a deeply ingrained warrior religion. Their central cult object was a long sword driven point first into a platform of earth or turf. They would worship this standing sword as a symbol of their war god, making offerings to it and swearing oaths before it. The visual similarity to the sword in the stone is immediate and profound. But the echoes grow even stranger. Their folklore spoke of a great leader, a fallen hero, who would one day return from the dead or from a magical sleep to lead his people again. This is the very essence of the Arthurian prophecy, that Arthur is not dead but sleeps, the once and future king who will return in Britain's hour of greatest need. Could these stories have traveled with the Sarmatian horsemen to the damp frontier of Roman Britain? We know that after their defeat by Rome, thousands of Sarmatian cavalry were indeed posted to Britain in the 2nd century, with some units remaining for generations, even centuries. They settled, they married local women, and their stories would have been told around campfires for decades. The theory suggests a slow generational fusion. The name of their respected Roman commander, Artorius, became attached to their own native legends of a sword-worshipping, returning hero. Over time, as Roman power faded and these communities blended with the local Britons, this composite figure was absorbed into the emerging folklore of a native defender. So is this cultural transmission or just a string of incredible coincidences? Scholars are sharply divided. Skeptics argue that the sword cult could be a universal symbol of power, and the idea of a sleeping hero is a common folk motif found in many cultures independently. They point out there is no direct, written evidence that these specific Sarmatian tales were circulating in post-Roman Britain. The connection relies on inference and a compelling pattern of similarities separated by both time and geography. Yet the pattern is undeniably striking. It presents a plausible mechanism for how some of the most magical, non-Roman elements of the Arthurian legend could have entered the tradition, not from Celtic myth but from the distant steppes. It transforms the legend from a purely homegrown British product into a potential archaeological artifact of the Roman Empire itself, a story forged at the crossroads of continents. This theory doesn't give us a historical King Arthur, but it might explain why his story feels so unique, woven with threads from a world far beyond the misty hills of Britain. While the Sarmatian theory offers a possible origin for the legend's magical elements, another candidate emerges from the historical record with a story that reads like a lost Arthurian tragedy. In the turbulent year 470, a Gallic chronicler named Jordanes records a pivotal event. A king named Riothermus, leading an army of 12,000 Britons, crossed the English Channel into Gaul. His mission was noble, answering a call from the crumbling Roman Empire to fight against the expanding Gothic kingdoms. Here was a documented British king, bearing the title King of the Britons, conducting a large-scale military campaign on the continent. The parallels begin to mount. Riothermus achieved some initial success, but then, according to Jordanes, he was betrayed by a Roman official and faced a devastating defeat. After this last battle, Riothermus simply vanishes from history, disappearing into the region of Burgundy without a trace. The story is hauntingly familiar, a British king crossing the sea, fighting for a righteous cause, betrayed by an ally, and meeting an ambiguous, fog-shrouded end. It mirrors the later tales of Arthur's own continental wars and his mysterious final departure to the Isle of Avalon after the Battle of Camlan. The connection is so compelling it begs the question, could the historical tragedy of Riothermus have provided the skeletal frame for Arthur's epic biography? Scholars digging deeper uncovered another fascinating clue, this time in the name itself. Riothermus is almost certainly not a personal name but a title. It derives from the Britannic language, a combination of words meaning highest or most supreme and king or ruler. Riothermus literally translates to supreme king or high king. This is not what he was called, it is what he was. Now consider the legendary name Arthur. One prominent theory suggests it stems from the Roman family name Artorius, as we discussed. But what if, in the chaotic oral tradition of the 5th and 6th centuries, stories became tangled? What if the great deeds of the High King, Riothermus, were gradually transferred onto a celebrated war leader remembered by the name or title Arthur? Over generations, as the Britannic language evolved and memories faded, the title Supreme King and the name of a local hero could have fused into a single legendary figure. The man who vanished in Burgundy after a betrayal and the champion who fell at Camlan might be two separate historical strands woven into one immortal story. This theory presents a powerful narrative logic. It provides a historical kernel for Arthur's otherwise puzzling continental campaigns, which seem out of place for a British warlord solely defending his homeland. It offers a poignant, historically attested end, a disappearance that easily transforms into a magical departure in legend, and it explains the title King of the Britons, which Geoffrey of Monmouth would later lavish upon his fictional emperor. Riothamus stands as perhaps the most historically solid figure to which the Arthurian legend has been anchored, a real king with a fate worthy of epic song. Yet the anchor chain is still made of inference, not ironclad proof. No chronicler calls Riothamus Arthur. His campaign, while monumental, occurs a generation or two before the traditional date for the Battle of Badon, the cornerstone of Arthur's military reputation in Britain. His story provides a magnificent template for the legend's ending, but not necessarily for its beginning or its central British context. He is a piece of the puzzle, a king whose real-life saga feels so Arthurian that it is difficult to believe the two are not connected. His existence proves that British kings did lead armies to glory and tragedy on the continent, that the stuff of legend was woven from real, heartbreaking history. The fate of Riothamus is a historical vanishing act. After his betrayal and defeat, the chronicles tell us he fled with what remained of his army to the territory of the Burgundians, a friendly kingdom, and then he is gone. The record falls silent. This is not a death recorded on a battlefield. It is a disappearance into the fog of a foreign land. Now look at a map of that region in central France. You will find nestled in Burgundy a town named Avalon. The similarity to the mythical Isle of Avalon is not a coincidence, it is a direct linguistic link. Avalon, in the later legends, is the enchanted island where Arthur is taken after the fatal Battle of Camlan, a place of healing where his mortal wounds are tended, and from which he is prophesied to return when Britain needs him most. Could the story have begun here with a simple geographical mistake? Did tales of the High King's final refuge near a place called Avalon, carried back to Britain by survivors or traders, slowly transform in the telling? Over generations and across languages, near Avalon could have easily become to Avalon, a mystical destination rather than a real town. His unknown fate, a king who simply vanished without a grave, provided the perfect blank canvas. In the absence of a body, hope thrives. A people longing for a savior would not accept that their great champion was merely dead and buried in a foreign field. Instead, they crafted a more beautiful truth. He was not gone, he was healing. He was not defeated, he was waiting. The legend of the once and future king, sleeping until his nation's hour of greatest need, is the ultimate act of poetic resistance against the harsh finality of history. It takes a documented historical event, a king's disappearance in Burgundy, and spins from it a timeless myth of hope and return. This connection is powerfully seductive, offering a clear bridge from a chronicled event to a core element of the folklore. Yet we must pause and consider the other possibility. Perhaps the name Avalon is just a remarkable coincidence. The concept of a Celtic otherworld, an island of apples and healing, existed in mythology long before Riothamus or Arthur. This paradisiacal isle was called Annwn in Welsh myth. Could the legend of Avalon have arisen independently from this deep well of Celtic belief, and the similarity to the Burgundian town's name be nothing more than a lucky accident that later writers seized upon to ground the myth in a real location? The debate hinges on whether we see legend as a top-down process, where a single historical event seeds a story, or a bottom-up one, where ancient pre-existing myths attract and reshape historical figures to fit their patterns. With Riothamus, we might be witnessing both forces at work. His real, tragic disappearance provided the perfect historical catalyst, a mystery that naturally invited a mythical explanation. The existing Celtic concept of a healing otherworld, possibly already associated with the name Avalon, was the ready-made narrative that rushed in to fill the void. The man and the myth met at a point of profound historical uncertainty, and a legend was cemented. So, did a king's flight to Burgundy create the tale of Avalon, or did the ancient tale of Avalon simply claim another king? The answer is likely a whisper of both, a testament to how history and folklore dance together in the dark, each giving form to the other. While the story of Rhyothemis echoes with the legend's end, another candidate provides a potential origin for its very heart, the defense of Britain itself. This man is Ambrosius Aurelianus, and he is the closest thing we have to a contemporary account of a post-Roman British hero. We meet him not in a romantic epic, but in a fiery sermon written around the year 540 by a monk named Gildas in a work called On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. Gildas, a man seething with anger at the moral failings of his own people, provides our only near eyewitness glimpse into the chaos of the 5th century. Amidst his condemnations, he pauses to offer a single glimmer of hope, a man of modest Roman birth whose parents, he says, had worn the purple, meaning they were of the senatorial class. This man, Ambrosius Aurelianus, is described as the last of the Romans. He rallied the scattered and desperate Britons, organizing them into a coherent fighting force against the relentless Saxon advance. Under his leadership, Gildas tells us, the Britons won a series of battles culminating in the siege of Mount Badon, a victory so decisive it brought a generation of peace. Do you hear the familiar rhythm, a noble leader of Roman heritage uniting the Britons and winning the great era-defining victory at Badon? This is not a legend from 800 years later. This is a report from a man who may have been alive when the children of the Badon veterans were still telling stories. So where does Arthur fit into this? One compelling theory is shockingly simple. Arthur was not a separate person at all. The name Arthur and all the legendary tales that grew around it could be a later folkloric spin-off from the historical achievements of Ambrosius. Think of it like this: a great leader performs extraordinary deeds. In life, he is known by his Roman name, Ambrosius, but in the songs and stories told by firesides for generations after his death, he acquires a new, more powerful nickname or title, perhaps derived from the old Roman Artorius or from a Celtic word for bear, Arth. Over time, as the memory of the Roman world faded, the man and his legendary title split into two separate figures in the popular imagination. The historical organizer Ambrosius remained in the chronicles. The legendary battle champion Arthur took flight in song. Another possibility is that Arthur was a real but lesser-known figure who operated in the shadow of this great man. Perhaps he was Ambrosius's most brilliant lieutenant, his cavalry commander, or even his successor. This subordinate's personal bravery and tactical genius on the battlefield could have made him a folk hero to the common soldiers, while history recorded the strategic victories under the name of his commander, Ambrosius. After both were gone, the more famous name, Ambrosius, anchored the historical record, while the more charismatic, perhaps younger hero's name, Arthur, blossomed into the stuff of epic. This theory solves several puzzles. It explains why Gildas, our earliest source, never mentions an Arthur, even when describing the very battle later attributed to him. It grounds the legend in a figure attested to by a near contemporary, and it reflects a common process in the birth of myths, where a complex historical reality simplifies into a single, iconic name representing an era's struggle. Ambrosius Aurelianus gives us the historical spine, the last gasp of Roman order and military discipline holding back the darkness. Arthur gives us the soul, the immortal champion born from the hope that spine inspired. They may not have been two men, but two sides of the same fading coin, one stamped with history, the other with destiny. But words on a page can only take us so far. To find the man behind the myth, we must leave the library and walk the ground he might have walked. Our search now turns from fragile manuscripts to the enduring earth, to the windswept cliffs and fortified hills that hold their own silent testimony. Two sites in particular stand as monumental bookends to the Arthurian legend, places where archaeology has whispered tantalizing secrets about the world a historical Arthur would have known. The first is a place of raw, dramatic power, a location so perfectly suited to legend that it feels destined for myth. Jutting into the Atlantic on the north coast of Cornwall is Tintagel. Today, its ruins are a spectacular tourist destination, but in the 5th and 6th centuries, this was no sleepy village. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, placed the dramatic story of Arthur's conception here, where the wizard Merlin disguised King Uther Pendragon to sneak into the fortress of the Duke of Cornwall. For centuries, this was dismissed as pure romantic fiction, a dramatic setting invented for a dramatic story. Then, the archaeologists arrived. Their excavations uncovered something astonishing: fragments of sleek, reddish pottery known as Phocaean red slipware, an elegant amphory that once held olive oil and wine from the eastern Mediterranean. This was not local crockery. This was the fine dining set of the late Roman world, and it was dated precisely to the 5th and 6th centuries, the very era of our quest. The discovery was a revelation. Tintagel was not some mythical backwater. It was a major, thriving hub of international trade, a power center for a post-Roman British kingdom that maintained sophisticated economic links across the known world. This was a seat of wealth, influence, and likely significant political power, who ruled from this impregnable cliff-top fortress, controlling this flow of luxury goods. The name history has forgotten, but the legend remembers. While Tintagel speaks to the conception of the legend, another site, over 100 miles to the east, shouts of military might. Cadbury Castle in Somerset is not a castle in the medieval sense, but a massive Iron Age hill fort, its vast earthen ramparts refortified and reused in the post-Roman period. Local folklore has stubbornly called this place Camelot for centuries. Again, archaeologists took the stories seriously. Their digs revealed something extraordinary. In the 5th and 6th centuries, someone had massively reinforced the ancient defenses. They built a formidable timber-revetted rampart, a grand gatehouse suitable for a procession of horsemen, and a large timber hall at the summit. This was not a peasant refuge. It was the headquarters of a powerful warlord, a dux bellorum commanding significant resources and manpower. The scale of the fortifications implies control over a wide territory. The hall suggests a ruler who held court and feasted his warriors, and the strategic location commands the surrounding plain. Here, on this fortified hill, we can almost hear the clatter of hooves and the clamor of a warrior elite, the very brotherhood that would later be remembered as the Knights of the Round Table. Neither site offers a sign saying Arthur was here. What they provide is something far more valuable: context. They prove that in the obscure 5th and 6th centuries, there were indeed powerful, sophisticated kingdoms in Britain, with rulers who lived in high-status settlements, traded across oceans, and commanded armies from impregnable strongholds. The world described in the barest fragments of history, a world capable of producing a figure like Arthur, was not a fantasy. It was real. Tintagel and Cadbury Castle give that shadowy period a physical shape, and in doing so, they make the legend feel less like a fairy tale and more like a distant echo of a lost but very tangible reality. But the most dramatic whisper from Tintagel's soil came not from pottery, but from a piece of slate. In 1998, archaeologists working in the lower courtyard uncovered a stone fragment, a discarded piece of building material bearing an inscription. It was dated to the 6th century. Scratched into its surface was a Latin name, Artugnu. The inscription reads, "Artugnu, father of a descendant of Coll, has had this made." Artugnu, the name is not Arthur, but its root is electrifying. In the Britannic language of the time, art means bear and nu means knowing. Artugnu translates to bear knowing, or perhaps the knowing one of the bear. Arthur's own name is widely believed to derive from the same root, arth, meaning bear. Could Archaeology be a variant, a cousin name, belonging to a nobleman living in this very fortress during the Arthurian period? The discovery sent a shockwave through the academic and popular imagination. Here, at last, was a physical artifact from the right place and the right time, bearing a name that seemed to resonate with the legend's core. It felt like a ghostly signature from the edge of history. Yet, as with all things Arthurian, the initial excitement was met with sober scrutiny. Archaeology is not Arthur. It is a different, though related, name. It could simply be a common name for the period, belonging to a local chieftain or craftsman with no connection to any legendary king. The stone itself is humble, a reused piece of slate, not a royal monument. Its power lies not in proof, but in profound possibility. It does not tell us King Arthur lived at Tintagel. It tells us that in the 6th century, a man with a bear-linked name, a man of sufficient status to commission a building, was present at a site of immense power that would later be irrevocably tied to Arthur's story. It is a coincidence so resonant it feels like a clue, a single puzzle piece that fits perfectly into the silhouette of the legend, even if we cannot see the full picture. While Tintagel hints at a name, another site, over 100 miles to the east, shouts of raw military power. For centuries, the people of Somerset have pointed to a vast, grassy hill fort known as Cadbury Castle and called it Camelot. This was not a tourist invention, but a deep, local tradition passed down through generations. In the 1960s, the archaeologist Leslie Alcock decided to take that folklore seriously and excavated the site. What he uncovered was not a medieval castle, but something far more compelling for our search. The ancient Iron Age ramparts, built centuries before, showed clear evidence of having been massively rebuilt and refortified in the 5th and 6th centuries. This was not a minor repair job. Someone had constructed a formidable timber-laced defensive wall, a grand gateway, and a large timber hall complex at the summit. The scale of the construction required the command of a large labor force and a skilled military engineer. This was the stronghold of a Dux Bellorum, a leader of battles, a man who ruled a territory and needed to project his power and defend it from all threats. The hall itself is particularly evocative. This was not just a barracks, it was a place of assembly where a ruler would feast his warriors, distribute plunder, and plan campaigns. You can almost see the firelight flickering on wooden pillars, hear the boasts and songs of a warrior elite gathered around their chieftain. This is the tangible, archaeological reality behind the later romantic idea of Camelot's court and the Knights of the Round Table. Cadbury Castle proves that the Britain of the late 5th and early 6th centuries was capable of producing powerful, centralized military leaders who operated from impressive, fortified capitals. It gives us the stage upon which a figure like Arthur could have truly stood. Between the inscribed name at Tintagel and the refortified ramparts of Cadbury, archaeology does not give us a king. It gives us the world that made a king necessary, a world of high-status individuals bearing significant names and warlords commanding hilltop fortresses, a world where legend finally finds a home in history. Yet even the most magnificent hill fort is just a silent stage. The true test of any legendary war leader lies not in his halls but on the battlefield. For Arthur, that battlefield has a name, one that echoes through the centuries as his defining triumph, the Battle of Mount Badon. This single conflict is the cornerstone of the entire legend, the pivotal moment where the Saxon tide was not just slowed but thrown back for a generation. It is the one event that appears like a stubborn fossil in the earliest layers of our historical record. Our main witness is once again the angry monk Gildas. Writing around the year 540, he describes this victory as the last great slaughter of the Saxons, a siege that brought a measure of peace to the land. He credits it to the leadership of Ambrosius Aurelianus, the last of the Romans, but here is the critical, deafening silence. Gildas does not mention an Arthur. Not a whisper, This omission is the single greatest obstacle for anyone trying to place a historical Arthur at the heart of this history. So how did Arthur become so firmly attached to Badon? The link appears 2.5 centuries later in that problematic manuscript by Nennius. It is Nennius who lists Badon as the 12th and greatest of Arthur's 12 battles. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth writes his history, the connection is unshakable. Arthur's legacy is sealed with this victory. This creates a fascinating puzzle. Did a later generation simply transfer the glory of Badon from the historical Ambrosius to the more folkloric figure of Arthur? Or was Arthur there all along, perhaps as a brilliant tactical commander under Ambrosius, whose personal heroism on that day became the stuff of soldiers' songs, eventually overshadowing his superior in popular memory? The truth is, we cannot know, but the sheer weight of Badon in the tradition suggests something powerful. If a man named Arthur did achieve lasting fame in the 5th or 6th century, it almost certainly rested on a military success of this magnitude. A victory that secured 50 years of peace would have been a cosmic event for the people who lived through it. The name of the commander who delivered that miracle would be carved into the collective soul of a nation, repeated around firesides for centuries. Finding the actual site of this legendary battle, however, is like trying to catch smoke. The name Mount Badon offers little help. It could refer to a hill near the city of Bath, from the Old English Badancista, Bath City. It could be a hill in Dorset or somewhere in the Welsh Marches. Over 30 locations have been proposed, from Liddington Castle in Wiltshire to the sprawling hill fort of Badbury Rings in Dorset. Each has its champions and its geographical logic, but not a single piece of archaeological evidence, no mass grave, no concentrated layer of weapons, definitively marks any of them as the field. The date is just as elusive. Gildas, frustratingly vague, places it in the year of his own birth, 43 years and 1 month before he wrote his sermon. That would put Badon around the year 500, but even that calculation is debated by scholars who pick apart his Latin phrasing. Dates ranging from 490 to 520 are all argued with passion. This ambiguity is telling. It shows that while the memory of a great victory was indelible, the precise details of where and when were lost to time, smoothed away by generations of retelling. And that is perhaps the most important clue of all. The Battle of Mount Badon stands as a historical event that transcends its own specifics. It represents a turning point, a moment when the darkness receded. For the Britons, it became a symbol of hope and resistance, and symbols need heroes. Whether the man who led that charge was named Ambrosius or Arthur or something else entirely, the victory demanded a champion worthy of its legacy. The legend of Arthur did not create the Battle of Badon. It is far more likely that a real, seismic victory like Badon created the need for a legend, and the name Arthur was the one that history and story chose to carry that hope forward. If Badon was the glorious dawn of Arthur's legend, then Camlan is its blood-red sunset. This is the final, fatal battle, the tragic end where Arthur falls, not to a foreign invader, but to the blade of his own kin, the traitor Mordred. While Badon symbolizes unity against a common foe, Camlan represents the opposite, a shattering from within. The story is one of heartbreaking betrayal. Arthur, away on campaign, learns that his nephew or son, Mordred, has seized his throne and his queen. He returns in fury, and the two armies meet at the ford of Camlan. In the brutal clash that follows, Arthur slays Mordred but is himself mortally wounded, leading to his departure to the mystical Isle of Avalon. It is a perfect operatic tragedy, the hero brought low by familial discord and the corruption of his own court. But could this poetic ending hold a grain of historical truth? To find out, we must look at what happened in Britain after the victory at Badon. The peace that followed, perhaps lasting 2 generations, would not have been a time of perfect harmony. With the immediate Saxon threat pushed back, the old pressures would have returned. The various British kings and warlords, no longer united by a common enemy, would have turned on each other, vying for land, cattle, and supremacy. Alliances forged in desperation would have frayed. This is the classic pattern of post-crisis politics. The very strength that saved Britain could have become the source of its next collapse. It is entirely plausible that the greatest British war leader of the age, the man who won at Badon, met his end not in a glorious last stand against the Saxons, but in a bitter internecine conflict with a rival British faction. Camlan, then, might not be a specific battle, but a legendary memory of this era of civil strife, a symbolic name given to the conflict that ended the golden age his victory had created. The enemy named Mordred could be a folkloric personification of this internal treachery and dynastic conflict. Is there any archaeological evidence for such a violent period? The answer is a grim yes. Across Britain, from hill forts to ancient boundaries, we find signs of heightened conflict in the 5th and 6th centuries. At the hill fort of South Cadbury, the very site linked to Camelot, the massive gateway shows evidence of having been violently destroyed and burned around this time. Other fortified sites bear similar scars of assault, not from invaders storming from the sea, but from neighbors attacking from the next valley. These are not the marks of the Saxon advance, but of British fighting British. While no battlefield has ever been found that we can point to and call Camlan, the landscape itself whispers of a time when the peace won by a great leader dissolved into familiar, bloody rivalry. So was Camlan a real battle? It is less likely to be a single, recorded historical event than a profound historical truth wrapped in a legendary name. It represents the inevitable decay of unity, the tragic flaw in the story of any golden age. The legend tells us Arthur's end came from betrayal within his own family, a metaphor for the brittleness of the coalition he must have led. In seeking the man behind the myth, Camlan may be the most revealing clue of all, for it points not to a fantastical villain, but to a painfully human end, the kind of downfall that has ended the reigns of real leaders throughout history. The fall was not from magic, but from the oldest, most mundane poison, the strife that follows victory. Camlan's tragedy reveals a profound truth about how legends are born. They are not forged in times of peace and clear record-keeping, but in the desperate, unstable fog of eras like Britain's so-called Dark Ages. When the lights of history go out, the human mind does not sit in darkness, it lights a fire and begins to tell stories. This is the mythic toolkit at work, a universal process where a community's fears, hopes, and fractured memories are hammered into a single, shining symbol. In the chaotic centuries after Rome's fall, the Britons faced invasion, the collapse of order, and the terrifying erosion of their own identity. What they needed was not just a history, but a mythology, a story that explained their suffering and promised a brighter dawn. They needed a hero who represented a glorious past they could remember with pride, and a future king who would one day return to save them. This longing for a golden age and a promised return is not unique to Britain. It is a deep, archetypal human response to catastrophe. So how does a flesh and blood man become such a symbol? The process is a kind of historical alchemy. First, take a real person who achieved something remarkable, like a stunning victory at Badon. His actual name might be Ambrosius or Riothamus or something lost entirely. Then, over generations of oral storytelling, his specific deeds begin to attract older, pre-existing folklore motifs like iron to a magnet. The concept of a magical sword embedded in stone or earth, a symbol of divine right from countless cultures, sticks to him. The memory of a powerful seer or prophet from Celtic tradition like Myrddin evolves into his personal wizard Merlin. Stories of noble warriors and their loyal brotherhood, a theme from Sarmatian camps or Germanic mead halls, crystallize around his court as the Knights of the Round Table. Even the tragic tale of a beautiful queen and a love that destroys a kingdom, a story as old as storytelling itself, becomes attached to his reign as the saga of Guinevere and Lancelot. Arthur is the ultimate case study in this distillation. The historical record offers us only fragments, a name in a poem, a list of battles, a fortified hill. But those fragments were sharp and potent. They were placed into the crucible of a people's desperate need for a unifying figure. The process was not one of invention from nothing, but of aggregation and amplification. Every story of resistance, every memory of Roman dignity, every folk tale about enchanted swords and sleeping heroes was poured onto the name Arthur. He became the vessel that could hold it all. The man, whoever he was, disappears into this symbolic function. He is no longer a commander who made tactical decisions, but the once and future king, an eternal representation of British resilience. This is how history becomes legend, not through careful documentation, but through the powerful collective act of a people writing their hopes into the empty spaces of their past. The need for a national hero did not just preserve a man, it actively created one from the pieces history left behind. To find the wild, primal heart of the Arthurian legend, we must journey into the misty hills of Wales. Long before Geoffrey of Monmouth crafted his imperial king, the name Arthur echoed through the halls of ancient Celtic storytelling. Here, in manuscripts like the Mabinogion, we meet a figure utterly alien to the crowned sovereign of Camelot. This is Arthur not as a monarch holding court, but as a warrior chieftain of almost mythic proportion, the leader of a band of heroes on impossible quests. The most vivid portrait comes from a tale called Culhwch and Olwen, one of the oldest surviving pieces of British prose literature. In this story, Arthur is not the central character, but a powerful ally whose court is the ultimate destination for any hero seeking aid. His base is not a stone castle, but a fortress, perhaps a hill fort like Cadbury. His men are not knights bound by chivalric code, but a brotherhood of specialists, each possessing a single, supernatural skill. There is a man who can hear an ant stirring 50 miles away, another who can hold his breath underwater for 9 days, and one whose magical sword can kill from hilt to tip. This is a world of magic, shape-shifting, and colossal talking animals. Arthur himself is a figure of immense semi-divine ability. He is a hunter of legendary beasts, most famously the magical boar Twrch, a creature so terrible its bristles could pierce armor, and between its ears is a comb and scissors the hero needs to win his bride. This Arthur leads his warband on a chaotic, continent-spanning hunt across Wales and Cornwall, a far cry from the orderly jousts of later romance. He battles giants and witches, and his authority stems not from a divine right to rule, but from his personal prowess and the loyalty of his fantastical companions. This is the Celtic bedrock of the legend. This Arthur is a folkloric superhero, a remnant of a pre-Christian, warrior-based society where the boundaries between man, myth, and the natural world were fluid. He is a defender of his people against supernatural threats, a figure rooted deeply in the landscape and cosmology of native Britain. The significance of this Welsh tradition cannot be overstated. It proves that the character of Arthur was not invented by Geoffrey of Monmouth. For centuries before the history of the kings of Britain, he was a living, evolving figure in the oral tradition of the Britons. He belonged to them, a hero of their own soil and stories. Geoffrey's genius was not in creation, but in transformation. He took this wild, pagan chieftain and meticulously dressed him for a new role. He smoothed out the magical chaos, replaced the warrior band with a court of noblemen, and set the crown of a Christian emperor upon his head. He co-opted a native British folk hero and repurposed him as a unifying symbol for a new, Norman-influenced Britain. So, when we search for the man behind the myth, this Welsh Arthur presents a crucial duality. He shows us how a historical war leader's reputation could easily absorb these older, magical stories, becoming a magnet for every tale of heroic defense. But he also reminds us that the figure we call King Arthur is a palimpsest, a parchment where the fierce Celtic warrior was never fully erased, only written over by the scribe's vision of a perfect Christian king. But the wild Welsh hope for a returning king posed a direct threat to the new rulers of England. In the year 1191, a fire tore through the great abbey at Glastonbury, a site already steeped in ancient Christian mystique and whispered connections to the legend of Avalon. During the reconstruction, the monks made a staggering announcement. Deep beneath the charred ruins, they claimed to have unearthed a massive hollowed-out oak log, and inside it, the skeletal remains of a gigantic man and a woman. A lead cross was found with the bodies, inscribed in Latin. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. The news was a medieval sensation. Here was not just a story, but physical proof. The legendary king had been found, and he was very, very dead. For the monks of Glastonbury, the timing was impeccable. Their abbey needed funds for a costly rebuild, and what better draw for wealthy pilgrims than the tomb of Britain's greatest hero? The discovery promised a flood of donations from the faithful and the curious. But the political motive ran even deeper. The ruling Plantagenet dynasty under King Henry II and later Richard the Lionheart faced persistent rebellion in Wales, where the prophecy of Arthur's return fueled nationalist resistance. The idea of a sleeping king who would one day rise to lead the Britons to victory was a powerful rallying cry against English rule. By producing Arthur's bones, the English crown and its loyal monks performed a brilliant act of political theatre. They were sending an unmistakable message to the Welsh: Arthur is not sleeping. He is not coming back to save you. He is right here in our ground, under our control. The legend was being physically buried to extinguish a living hope. The discovery was almost certainly a clever, pious fraud. The description of the find changed in later accounts, growing more elaborate. The lead cross itself, which survived for centuries before disappearing, bore an inscription style that scholars later identified as more typical of the 10th century than the 6th. The entire event reeks of staged management, from the convenient location to the theatrical reveal. Yet its impact was profound. It anchored the soaring, uncertain legend to a specific patch of earth. It gave the myth a grave, and in doing so, attempted to end the story. This was the ultimate manipulation of folklore for real-world power. The Plantagenets were not just ruling land, they were attempting to rule the narrative itself, to own the past in order to secure their future. Glastonbury's claim shows us the legend's dangerous potency. It was no longer just a story, it was a political weapon. The man behind the myth had become a pawn in a game of thrones, his bones a tool to break a nation's spirit. The political theatre at Glastonbury attempted to bury the legend, but its spirit was already taking a new and even more magnificent form. The wild Welsh chieftain and his band of supernatural specialists were about to undergo a profound transformation, one that would elevate Arthur's companions from a rugged war band into the very definition of medieval nobility. This evolution begins with a simple, powerful object, the Round Table. In the Welsh tales, Arthur's men feasted in his hall, but their seating was likely a matter of rank and favor. The concept of a round table, introduced by the Anglo-Norman poet Wace in his Roman de Brut in 1155, was a stroke of symbolic genius. A table with no head erases hierarchy. Every knight seated around it is equal in dignity and voice, bound only by their shared loyalty to the king and their common code. This was not a reflection of Dark Age reality, but an idealized vision for a new aristocratic class. It transformed Arthur's fortress from a chieftain's stronghold into a court of perfect fellowship, a model for how a noble lord should treat his finest men. This model required a new kind of hero, and he arrived from across the English Channel. In the late 12th century, French poets, most notably Chrétien de Troyes, reinvented the legend for a courtly audience obsessed with romance, refined manners, and spiritual quests. They introduced a knight who would come to define chivalry itself, Lancelot du Lac. He was everything the older Welsh heroes were not. where they possessed brute strength or magical skills, Lancelot was defined by his inner conflicts, his unparalleled prowess in single combat, and most importantly, his forbidden, consuming love for Queen Guinevere. This love triangle injected a devastating human drama into the heart of the legend, making the fall of Camelot not just a military defeat, but a moral collapse stemming from personal failing. Lancelot represented the pinnacle and the peril of the chivalric ideal, a knight so perfect in arms yet so flawed in love that he becomes the instrument of his king's downfall. Alongside this new focus on courtly love came an even higher calling, the quest for the Holy Grail. Creation began this story, but others expanded it into a full-blown spiritual epic. The Grail, often depicted as the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, became the ultimate object of divine pursuit. It was a test of purity, not just strength. The greatest knights of the Round Table, led by the saintly Galahad, Lancelot's son, would ride out not to hunt magical boars, but to seek a sacred vision that only the most perfect could attain. This infusion of Christian piety completely reshaped the legend's purpose. Arthur's court was no longer just a center of military power. It was a launching point for a sacred crusade, a gathering of Christendom's finest on a mission from God. The Grail quest symbolized the medieval aristocracy's desire to sanctify their violent profession, to frame knighthood as a holy duty. Each of these additions, the Round Table, Lancelot, and the Grail, served to distance the legend further from any historical warlord's reality. They were mirrors held up to the values of 12th and 13th century feudal society, reflecting its dreams of perfect order, its complex rules of love and honor, and its deep Christian fervor. The gritty, survivalist world of a post-Roman Dux Bellorum had been meticulously covered over with tapestries of silk and scripture. Arthur was no longer a British commander. He was the archetype of the Christian king, presiding over a chivalric utopia that was always destined to fracture from within. This evolution shows the legend not as a fixed story, but as a living tradition, constantly adapting to feed the hungers of a new age, hungers for equality, for romantic tragedy, and for divine grace. The most powerful part of the Arthurian legend is not his life, but his supposed death. He is not dead, the stories insist, he only sleeps. Wounded at Camlan, he was taken to the mystical Isle of Avalon to be healed of his mortal injuries, and there he waits, the once and future king, promised to return when his people need him most. This is not a simple fairy tale ending. It is a profound cultural promise, a narrative loophole against despair. In a world of conquest and loss, the idea that your greatest hero is merely in repose, that the Golden Age could be restored with his awakening, is an act of defiant hope. This motif connects Arthur to a vast family of European folklore known as the King in the Mountain. From Germany's Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, said to sleep in a cavern under the Kifhiusa mountain, to Portugal's King Sebastian, who vanished in battle and is awaited as a hidden redeemer, cultures across the continent have crafted identical stories. They are tales of suspended animation where a national savior is preserved in a magical state, often with his loyal knights, ready to ride out when a prophesied sign appears, like ravens ceasing to fly around the mountain or a specific number of years passing. These stories arise from identical psychological soil, the trauma of a catastrophic defeat or a period of foreign domination. The sleeping king is a placeholder for national identity itself, kept safe underground until the time is right for it to re-emerge. This belief was never passive folklore, it was a live political charge. For centuries after the Norman conquest of England, the Welsh clung fiercely to the prophecy of Arthur's return. It fueled their resistance, giving them a spiritual advantage over their more powerful adversaries. The English kings understood this threat perfectly, which is why the discovery of Arthur's bones at Glastonbury was such a calculated political move. It was a direct attempt to debunk the prophecy, to prove the king was dead and buried under English soil, and therefore could not come back to lead a Welsh revolt. Yet the belief proved harder to kill than any man. Centuries later, during the profound national crises of the First and Second World Wars, the imagery of Arthur was resurrected not as a rebel, but as a patriotic icon for all of Britain. Poets and propagandists invoked the Knights of the Round Table as symbols of chivalric sacrifice and the defense of civilization. The very phrase "the once and future king" took on a new, urgent meaning, suggesting that the spirit of Arthur, the spirit of Britain itself, would rise to meet the modern darkness just as the legendary king had risen to fight the Saxons. The myth was flexible enough to serve opposing causes, from Welsh nationalism to British imperial unity, because its core promise was timeless, the assurance that a nation's essential character is never truly lost, only waiting. This enduring power reveals the ultimate truth of our quest. The search for the historical Arthur, while fascinating, may ultimately be secondary. His real impact lies not in who he was, but in what he represents. He is a blank slate upon which generations have projected their deepest fears and highest aspirations. In times of invasion, he is the defiant war leader. In times of political fragmentation, he is the uniting High King. In times of moral uncertainty, he is the just monarch of a chivalric code. And in times of existential threat, he is the sleeping giant of national destiny, whose return is always just over the horizon. The man, if he existed, vanished into that symbolic function over 1,000 years ago. The myth, however, is very much alive because it answers a permanent human need, the need to believe that our heroes are not gone, that our best days are not behind us, and that in the darkest hour, hope itself can awaken from its long slumber. The sleeping king endures because we need him to, but modern scholarship asks us to separate that profound need from the search for fact. For many contemporary historians, the quest for a single historical Arthur has reached its logical end, and the conclusion is stark. They argue that King Arthur, as we understand him, is not a lost figure of history waiting to be found, but a composite literary creation, a magnificent fiction woven together from many threads over many centuries. This is not a dismissal of the legend's power, but a rigorous examination of the evidence, or more accurately, the profound lack of it. The central problem lies in the nature of our sources. Every text that mentions Arthur in detail was written centuries after the events it describes. Nennius wrote 300 years later, Geoffrey of Monmouth over 600 years later. These are not eyewitness accounts, they are collections of folklore, political propaganda, and creative storytelling. They are biased by the desires of their authors, whether to inspire a nation or to sell copies to a fascinated public. To build a historical biography from these layers of fiction is, in the view of these scholars, like trying to reconstruct a real person from the pages of a fantasy novel. The timeline itself collapses under scrutiny. The legendary Arthur is often placed in the late 5th or early 6th century, yet the first detailed stories of him as a king appear in the 12th. That is a silence spanning 600 years, a period longer than from the Middle Ages to today. If a king of such grandeur truly ruled, reshaping the fate of Britain, would he not leave some trace in the records kept by neighboring kingdoms or in the fragments of his own people? His absence from the near-contemporary account of Gildas, who details the era and its great victory at Badon but never names Arthur, is a silence that echoes loudly. So what, then, is Arthur? Many academics propose he was not a name but a function. The word itself may have originated as a title, like Riothamus meaning supreme king, or perhaps it was an honorific derived from the Roman Artorius. In the chaotic post-Roman period, multiple war leaders could have borne this title or been compared to this legendary standard. One man might have won a great victory at Badon. Another might have been betrayed and vanished in Gaul. A third might have ruled from a fortified hill like Cadbury. Over generations, as these stories were sung by bards and written by monks, the deeds of several different champions and perhaps even pre-existing Celtic gods or heroes slowly merged. The scattered accomplishments of an era were consolidated and attributed to one superlative figure, a symbolic vessel strong enough to carry all the hopes of a people. In this view, Arthur is not a man who became a myth. He is a myth that was assembled from the pieces of many men, a legendary persona created to make sense of a turbulent and poorly remembered age. His round table holds not just knights but the ghosts of forgotten warriors, all given a single immortal name. If Arthur is a myth assembled by history, he is a masterpiece perfected by storytellers. The final, definitive form of the legend as we know it was cast not in a Dark Age forge, but in an English prison cell. In the 15th century, a knight and occasional outlaw named Sir Thomas Malory, while imprisoned for various crimes, compiled and translated the sprawling French romances into a single, monumental English work, Le Morte d'Arthur. Malory did not invent new tales, but he gave the legend its most influential shape. His prose was direct, powerful, and focused on the chivalric tragedy, weaving the disparate threads of the Round Table, the Grail quest, and the fatal love of Lancelot and Guinevere into one seamless, heartbreaking narrative. It was Malory who cemented the iconic sequence of events, from the Sword in the Stone to the final voyage to Avalon, and it was his version that William Caxton printed, making the legend accessible to a mass readership for the first time. Malory's Arthur became the standard, a touchstone for every retelling that followed. Centuries later, in the Victorian era, the poet Alfred, Lord Tennyson revisited the legend with a profoundly different spirit. His Idylls of the King is not a tale of martial adventure, but a moral and spiritual allegory for his age. Tennyson's Camelot is a shining citadel of Victorian ideals, a project of moral order constantly besieged by doubt, sensuality, and betrayal. His Arthur is a figure of almost unbearable piety and earnestness, a ruler whose perfect kingdom is doomed by the flawed humanity within it. Tennyson transformed the medieval romance into a poignant commentary on his own society's anxieties about faith, progress, and social decay. Then, in the shadow of another world war, a new voice reimagined Arthur for the 20th century. T.H. White's The Once and Future King is neither pure romance nor stern allegory, but a deeply human, tragicomic, and psychological exploration of power. White, writing during the rise of fascism, used Arthur's story to ask urgent questions about war, justice, and the education of a ruler. His Merlin lives backwards in time, giving him a weary, modern cynicism. His Arthur, nicknamed the Wart, learns that might is not right, and his doomed attempt to establish a rule of law through the Round Table becomes a heartbreaking parable for the failure of civilization itself. Each of these literary giants did not merely retell a story, they reinvented it, using the Arthurian framework to explore the deepest concerns of their own eras. From Malory's feudal code to Tennyson's moral crisis to White's existential dread in the atomic age. This process of reinvention exploded with the dawn of cinema. Film and television did not just adapt the legend, they fractured it into 1,000 reflections, each searching for a new angle on the ancient tale. John Boorman's 1981 film Excalibur is a perfect example. A visually stunning operatic spectacle that leans fully into the mythic and magical. It presents a dark ages of gleaming, anachronistic armor where the land and the king are one, and the story is driven by potent symbols, the Grail, the sword, the dragon, more than historical logic. It seeks the legend's primal, psychological core, not its historical one. In stark contrast, films like King Arthur from 2004 explicitly marketed themselves as peeling back the myth to reveal the gritty historical truth. This version presented Arthur as a Roman cavalry officer, Artorius, leading Sarmatian horsemen in a bleak, muddy, and politically complex Britain. While still a work of fiction, its intent was to answer the popular question, what might the real man have been like, grounding the fantasy in a plausible, if speculative, historical reality. Every adaptation, from the musical fantasy of Camelot to the streetwise magic of the Sword in the Stone, From the mystical drama of the BBC's Merlin to the bleak revisionism of the Green Knight serves a dual purpose. First, it keeps the legend vibrantly alive in the popular imagination, introducing new generations to its characters and themes. But second, and more fascinatingly, each new version reignites the ancient search for the core. By constantly reimagining Arthur as a doomed romantic, a savvy general, a wise ruler, or a reluctant hero, our culture performs a collective act of archaeology on the myth itself. We are not looking for one true story, but testing the legend's boundaries, asking what elements are essential and what can be changed. The Hollywood quest for a grittier, more historical Arthur is, in its own way, a continuation of the same scholarly pursuit, a desire to touch something real beneath the layers of fantasy. The fiction does not obscure the search for history, it fuels it, proving that our fascination with the man behind the myth is as enduring as the promise of his return. Perhaps the most radical answer to our quest is that we have been asking the wrong question entirely. What if Arthur was never a person to begin with, but something far more powerful, a symbol born from the collective trauma of a people? Some scholars propose that the legend is not a distorted biography, but a cultural memory, a story that encodes a historical truth too large for any single name. In this view, Arthur represents the last, fading ghost of Roman military order in Britain. For centuries, the Roman legions meant security, discipline, and civilization. When those legions withdrew, leaving the island vulnerable, the memory of that protective power did not vanish. It lingered in the stories people told. The figure of Arthur, the Dux Bellorum leading organized armies to victory, could be the folk memory of that lost Roman system personified. He is not a man, but the spirit of the legion itself, still marching in defense of the land long after the last eagle standard was carried away. Alternatively, Arthur might symbolize the fierce, protracted resistance of the Celtic Britons against the Anglo-Saxon settlers. The centuries-long struggle for control of the island was not a single war, but a slow, grinding process of advance and retreat, of kingdoms rising and falling. In the oral tradition, this complex, generations-long conflict needed a hero, a single champion to embody the entire centuries-long fight for survival. Arthur becomes that champion. Every local victory against the invaders, every tale of a brave chieftain holding a hill fort could have fed into this one overarching narrative. His 12 battles are not a real campaign, but a poetic compression of 100 smaller clashes, a symbolic history of the resistance itself. Even the name Arthur might point away from a human being and toward a divine or totemic origin. One compelling theory traces it back to the Celtic word for bear, Arth. In the cosmology of the ancient Britons, the bear was a potent symbol of strength, ferocity, and kingship. Could Arthur, the bear, have originally been a title for a warrior society or a clan that used the bear as its emblem? Or perhaps the name recalls a forgotten Celtic bear god, a protective deity of the land whose attributes were later transferred to a human hero. This would explain the supernatural aura that clings to him from the earliest Welsh tales. He is not a man who became a legend, but a god who was slowly made into a man, his divine power diluted into heroic deeds. This symbolic interpretation does not render our search meaningless, it simply changes its goal. If Arthur is a symbol, then the legend is not a broken historical record, but a perfectly preserved cultural artifact. It tells us not about one man's life, but about a society's deepest fears and highest aspirations. The story encodes what the post-Roman Britons valued, what they lost, and what they dreamed of recovering: perfect leadership, unity against a common foe, and a return to a golden age of justice and safety. Searching for the man, then, might be like trying to find the individual soldier who is Uncle Sam. You will never find him because he was never one person. He is the idea of a nation itself. This perspective invites us to listen to the legend not for facts, but for feelings, to hear in the epic of Camelot the echoes of a people's longing for a protector who never died because he was never born. He was always a hope waiting in the mists of memory. The sword in the stone, the wizard in the cave, the queen's betrayal, these feel uniquely Arthurian, yet they are not. They are universal mythic blocks found in stories across the world, rearranged to tell a new tale for a specific people in a specific time. This is the true DNA of the legend, a familiar pattern of hero-making that transcends any single culture. Consider the magical sword. Excalibur, drawn from stone or given by the Lady of the Lake, is a symbol of divine right and unmatched power. But it has countless siblings. In Norse myth, the god Frey wields a sword that fights on its own, a weapon he must ultimately give up. In Japanese legend, the sword Kusanagi is pulled from the tail of a slain serpent, a gift from the gods to a heroic emperor. These are not coincidences. The enchanted blade is a global shorthand, a narrative tool that instantly marks its bearer as the chosen one, separating the hero from the common warrior by a quality that is both supernatural and unquestionable. It answers a deep human need to believe that true leadership is not just earned but destined, revealed by a power greater than any army. The same pattern shapes the figure of Merlin. He is the archetype of the wise advisor, the prophet who sees the threads of fate. We find him in the druids of Celtic tradition, the shamans of Siberian folklore, and the seers of ancient Greece. He is Odin, who sacrificed an eye for wisdom in Norse myth, or the biblical prophet Samuel, anointing kings. This figure exists outside normal society, possessing knowledge of the past and future, and his role is always to guide, test, and sometimes orchestrate the rise of the hero. Merlin's magic is simply the local flavor, the specific cultural costume worn by this timeless character. His purpose is not to be historically plausible, but to provide a narrative mechanism, explaining the hero's extraordinary origin and lending a sense of preordained grandeur to his journey. Even the legend's most human tragedy, the love triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, follows a script written long before Camelot. Its mirror image is the Celtic tale of Tristan and Isolde, a story of a knight bound by loyalty to his king who falls into a doomed, irresistible love with the king's bride. The patterns are identical: a potion of fate, secret trysts, a betrayal that fractures a kingdom. This is not plagiarism, but the use of a powerful, pre-existing narrative template about the conflict between personal desire and sacred duty. These stories resonate because they explore a fundamental human tension, the way love can be both the highest ideal and the most destructive force, capable of unraveling the very social order the hero has sworn to protect. The legend of Arthur did not invent this theme, it simply dressed it in chainmail and set it at a round table. So what does this tell us about the search for a historical Arthur? It suggests that the legend we know is less a biography and more a magnificent collage. A real war leader's victory at Badon or a king's disappearance in Burgundy provided the compelling historical catalyst, the spark. But the flame that grew from it was fed by a vast, pre-existing stockpile of narrative fuel, the global motifs of the magical weapon, the wise guide, and the tragic romance. The Britons, and later the French and English poets, did not create a story from nothing. They assembled one from the deepest, most resonant parts of the human storytelling toolkit. This is why Arthur feels both uniquely British and strangely familiar to people from entirely different cultures. His tale is built from blocks we all recognize because they speak to hopes and fears we all share: the desire for a destined leader, the need for wise counsel, and the perennial danger of love and betrayal. The genius of the legend lies not in its originality, but in its perfect assembly of these universal parts into a single, unforgettable symbol for an island's lost history and enduring hope. The legend's power lies not in what it reveals about the past, but in what it exposes about ourselves. We are not just hunting for a forgotten king, we are seeking a mirror. The relentless search for a historical Arthur speaks to a profound human need, one that transcends dusty manuscripts and ancient battle sites. He represents something far more potent than a man. He is the embodiment of a lost golden age. In our collective imagination, Arthur's Camelot is not merely a castle. It is a perfect moment, a fleeting point in time where justice was administered from a round table, where might served right, and where a land was unified under a wise and virtuous leader. This vision is incredibly seductive, especially during periods of real-world crisis, fragmentation, or moral uncertainty. When our own societies feel divided or our leaders fall short, we look backward and project our ideals onto a hazy, heroic past. We create a time when things were right, when a true king held back the darkness. Arthur becomes the anchor for that dream. The quest to find him, to prove he was real, is ultimately an attempt to prove that the Golden Age was real too. It is an effort to ground our highest aspirations in history, to say that our ideals of justice, unity, and noble leadership are not just fantasies, but were once, however briefly, made flesh. This is why the story has been reshaped by every generation since. The medieval poets needed a model of chivalry, the Victorians a parable of moral order, and modern audiences a gritty, flawed leader. We keep remaking Arthur because we keep needing him. The details of the search, the analysis of a 6th century battle or a fragment of pottery are almost secondary. They are the methodology of a deeper, more emotional excavation. We are digging for hope. We want to believe that a figure of such moral and martial authority is not just a fictional character, but a possibility. Finding evidence for him, however slim, becomes evidence that our own better nature is not a fiction, that it too has roots and can be revived. In this light, the enduring mystery is a gift. The lack of definitive proof is what keeps the legend alive and malleable. A fully documented historical Arthur would be a closed chapter, a figure locked in the past. But a shadowy, half-seen warrior king is a canvas. His ambiguity allows every culture, every era, and every individual to project their own definition of heroism onto him. He can be a Christian monarch, a pagan chieftain, a Roman officer, or a symbol of resistance. The search for the man, therefore, becomes a ritual. It is a way for us to engage with our own values, to debate what true leadership looks like, and to yearn for a restoration of something we feel we have lost. The question is not really, did King Arthur exist? The question we are asking is, could such a person exist? And more importantly, do we still believe in the ideals he represents? The empty space where a historical figure should be is not a void. It is a sanctuary for our collective hopes. We pour into it our longing for unity in a divided world, for integrity in leadership, and for the promise that even in the darkest age, a light was once held high. That is the true magic of the legend. It convinces us that the story matters more than the history, and that the quest for the hero is, in the end, a quest for the best parts of ourselves. So where does this leave our quest? After sifting through the fragments of poetry, the layers of archaeology, and the echoes of global myth, a plausible middle ground begins to emerge from the mist. The most convincing historical scenario is not a single shining king, but a shadowy figure of immense military talent. Picture a man, or perhaps a succession of men, in the late 5th or early 6th century. He is a leader of the Britons, likely of Romanized heritage, educated in the fading arts of Roman strategy and discipline. He commands not from a castle, but from a refortified hill fort like Cadbury, a symbol of stubborn power in a collapsing world. His greatest achievement is the kind that echoes for generations, a crushing, definitive victory against the Saxon advance at a place called Mount Badon. This triumph secures a period of peace, a breathing space that later generations would remember as a golden age. His name may have been Artorius, a family name recalling Roman authority, or perhaps a title or nickname derived from the Celtic word for bear, a symbol of ferocious strength. This is the seed when he falls, likely not to a foreign enemy, but in the bitter civil strife that followed the peace he won. His story does not end. It enters the fertile ground of oral tradition. In the long, dark decades that followed, nostalgia for that brief peace and the leader who secured it grows powerful. His deeds are amplified in the songs of bards. His character begins to attract older, deeper stories, the Celtic myths of magical swords and otherworldly islands, the warrior cults of stationed Sarmatian cavalry, the universal archetype of the sleeping king. His historical reality becomes a magnet for folklore. Centuries later, scribes like Nennius collect these scattered battle poems and try to craft a history. Later still, Geoffrey of Monmouth and the French romancers, writing for their own audiences, drape this folk hero in the robes of a Christian emperor and the armor of a chivalric knight. They give him a round table, a tragic love, and a holy quest. The gritty Dux Bellorum is buried under layers of magnificent fiction, each layer reflecting the dreams of a new age. Therefore, the real Arthur is not a man we can dig up, nor a pure fantasy we can dismiss. He is an elusive fusion, a historical ripple that was shaped and magnified by the deepest currents of human storytelling. He is the memory of a great victory, wrapped in the hope for a returning savior, and polished by 1,000 years of poetic imagination. To search for him is to stand at the crossroads where history ends and legend begins, looking at a figure who is forever both. The search for Arthur ends not with a skeleton but with a reflection. We began with a king in shining armor, seated at a round table in a castle called Camelot, a figure of absolute certainty. We followed the trail back through time, past medieval romances and political frauds, into the fragmented chronicles of monks and the wild Welsh tales of magical boars. We sifted the soil of hill forts and weighed the theories of scholars, meeting Roman officers, vanished high kings, and battle leaders known only by their deeds. The glittering king slowly dissolved, leaving behind the stark, compelling silhouette of a shadowy warlord fighting to hold back the dark in a forgotten age. And then we watched as that silhouette, over centuries, was filled in once more with new dreams, becoming the chivalric monarch, the tragic husband, the once and future king. Our journey has been a perfect circle, from myth to possible man and back to myth again. This circular path is the entire point. We may never hold a relic and say, this belonged to King Arthur. The definitive historical figure is likely forever out of reach, lost in the silence between the fall of Rome and the rise of kingdoms. But in straining to hear his echo in that silence, we have uncovered something far more valuable than a single name. We have witnessed the breathtaking alchemy of storytelling, the fascinating, messy human process by which history becomes legend. A real victory at Badon, a real king's disappearance in Gaul, the real ruins of a powerful fort. These are the scattered seeds. National hope, political need, and the timeless templates of global myth are the rain and soil. Over generations, a mighty tree grows from that union, its roots in history and its branches in fantasy. We cannot find the seed anymore, but we can understand why the tree is so beautiful and why we are so drawn to its shade. So perhaps the ultimate answer to our quest is this: Arthur's true legacy was never about proving he existed. It is about the stories he carries. For over 1,000 years, his name has been a vessel for our deepest ideals: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the relentless pursuit of justice, the fragile dream of a united kingdom, and the stubborn, defiant flame of hope that insists a hero can return, that a golden age might be restored. He is a mirror held up to every era that retells his tale, reflecting its own fears and aspirations. That is a power no historical document could ever contain. The mystery remains, and so the conversation continues. Was your Arthur the noble Christian king, the gritty Roman cavalry officer, the bear-like Celtic chieftain, or something else entirely? Share your favorite theory or adaptation in the comments below. I read every one, And if you enjoyed this journey into the heart of a legend, subscribe for more explorations into the greatest historical mysteries ever told. The past is never just a list of dates, it is a story waiting to be uncovered.